Sophie had always dreamed of a better life. Growing up in a small town, she worked as a waitress, barely making ends meet. Her days were long, and her nights were filled with exhaustion. But everything changed the day she met Jack. He was different from the regular customers who came to the diner. Handsome, well-dressed, and confident, Jack was the type of man who commanded attention. When he walked into the diner, Sophie couldn't help but notice him. It started with casual conversations over coffee, then progressed to flirtation. He seemed genuinely interested in her, something Sophie had never experienced before. After a few weeks of these lighthearted interactions, Jack surprised her with an invitation to dinner. He was charming, attentive, and treated her like she was the only person in the room. Sophie was smitten, but what she didn't know was that Jack had been keeping a secret. Sophie didn't come from money, and neither did her family. Jack, however, was not just a regular millionaire. His wealth came from sources she never could have imagined, and it wasn't until after their whirlwind romance led to an unexpected marriage that the truth began to unravel. The perfect life Sophie thought she had found was about to turn into something far more complicated. 7 days into their honeymoon, Sophie started noticing strange things about Jack's behavior. There were moments when he seemed lost in thought, almost as if he was hiding something. And then there was the locked room. Sophie had always admired how open Jack was with her, but there was something about that room, a space he refused to let her enter, that started to eat at her curiosity. She tried to let it go, but the longer they stayed at the mansion, the more questions began to form in her mind. What was Jack hiding? And what would she discover when she finally found out the truth? The days passed, but Sophie's curiosity gnawed at her. Jack's sudden mood shifts, the way he would change the subject whenever she mentioned certain things, made her uneasy. But it was the locked room that haunted her thoughts the most. She had tried every excuse to find a way inside, asking about it directly, pretending to look for something, even innocently walking by. But every time Jack's response was the same. "It's nothing, just some old stuff I keep in there." She wanted to believe him, but something felt off. That night, as Jack fell asleep next to her, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to know more. Quietly, she slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the door. The key was right where Jack had left it, on the top shelf in the closet, a place he'd always said was just for safekeeping. Sophie's heart raced as she took the key in her hand, the cold metal sending a chill through her fingers. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but she knew she had to see for herself. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, dusty room. It looked like nothing more than an abandoned storage area, filled with old boxes and furniture covered in sheets. But as Sophie stepped further in, her eyes were drawn to something that didn't belong, a large locked briefcase sitting in the corner. It was different from the rest of the clutter, polished and out of place. She couldn't resist. Her hands trembled as she approached the briefcase and unlocked it, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, there were stacks of papers, documents, contracts, and photographs that didn't make sense. Sophie's eyes scanned the contents, and her breath caught in her throat when she saw one document in particular. It was a will, Jack's will. But it wasn't just any will. It was a will that named a completely different person as the sole beneficiary of his fortune. Sophie's mind raced. She didn't understand what she was seeing, but one thing was clear. Jack had been hiding something much bigger than she had ever imagined. The man she had married wasn't the man she thought he was. And now Sophie was tangled in a web of secrets that threatened to unravel everything she believed in. What did this will mean? And why had Jack kept it hidden from her? The truth was more complicated than she could have ever imagined. The discovery haunted Sophie. The will didn't just name someone else as Jack's beneficiary. It also included strange clauses that hinted at a deep connection with people Sophie had never heard of. She tried to confront Jack the next morning, but he brushed off her questions with a forced smile and vague excuses. Something in his eyes, though, told her that he knew she had uncovered his secret. As the days went on, Sophie found herself growing more distant from Jack. His perfect facade had begun to crack, and she couldn't ignore the feeling that he was hiding something far darker. But Sophie wasn't the type to back down. She needed answers, not just for her own peace of mind, but for the future of their marriage. If Jack was keeping this from her, what else was he capable of? Late one evening, after another strained dinner, Sophie made a decision. She would find out everything, no matter the cost. With the will still fresh in her mind, Sophie decided to follow Jack. For the first time, she realized just how little she truly knew about the man she had married. Sophie waited until Jack left the house, and then she quietly slipped into his study. There she found his phone, and it was unlocked. She hesitated for a moment. This felt wrong, like a violation of trust. But when the truth was staring her in the face, Sophie couldn't ignore it any longer. She scrolled through his messages and emails, each one revealing a deeper layer of the mystery. There were conversations with people she didn't recognize, names that didn't show up on any of the documents. They spoke in code, discussing sums of money that seemed far too large to be legitimate. Sophie's heart raced as she uncovered more. There were mentions of offshore accounts, illegal deals, and connections to a criminal organization she had never imagined. This wasn't just about wealth. It was about power and corruption on a scale that threatened to destroy everything. Suddenly, Sophie's mind flashed back to the first night they had met. Jack had been kind and charming, the perfect gentleman, but now she saw him for who he truly was, a man with secrets so dark that they could destroy her life if she wasn't careful. Sophie knew what she had to do next. She couldn't let Jack's lies continue, but the more she thought about it, the more complicated it became. Was she just another pawn in his game, or was there a way for her to take control of the situation? The truth would be even more dangerous than she had imagined. Sophie's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. The revelation of Jack's dark world left her feeling betrayed, confused, and vulnerable. She had no idea who he truly was, and the more she discovered, the less she recognized him. Yet there was a part of her that couldn't let go of the man she had fallen in love with. Was it possible that the Jack she had married, this charming, seemingly perfect millionaire, was just a mask? Her thoughts were interrupted when Jack returned home unexpectedly early that day. His eyes locked with hers, and there was a flicker of suspicion, as if he knew she had been digging into his past. Sophie quickly tried to cover up the unease she felt, but she couldn't shake the tension that hung in the air. Jack was different now. His usual confident demeanor was replaced with something colder, more guarded. "Is everything okay, Sophie?" he asked, his tone unusually sharp. Sophie hesitated, her mind racing. She had never been good at lying, but the truth felt too dangerous to expose. "Yeah, just tired," she replied, forcing a smile. Jack didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press her further. He went into his office and shut the door behind him, leaving Sophie standing in the hallway, her heart pounding. She had to act fast. She couldn't let this go on any longer. That night, while Jack was in his study, Sophie made another bold decision. She would confront him. No more hiding, no more running from the truth. She had already seen too much to turn back now. Sophie walked into the study, her hands trembling as she stood before Jack, who was absorbed in his work. "Jack," she began, her voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "We need to talk." Jack didn't look up, but the air in the room grew heavier. "About what?" "About you," Sophie said, her voice unwavering. "About your secrets." For the first time since their marriage, Jack finally looked at her. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of anger and something else. Regret, perhaps. "I didn't want you to find out this way," he said softly, "but you have every right to know." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "What's going on, Jack? What are you hiding?" He took a deep breath and stood up, walking over to her. "Sophie, the man you married isn't who you think he is. But before you judge me, you need to understand why I did what I did." For a moment, Sophie felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Jack would explain everything, and they could move forward. But the words that followed shattered that hope. "I didn't choose this life, Sophie. I was forced into it. The people I'm involved with, they own me. You're caught in the middle now, and I can't protect you from what's coming." Sophie's world tilted on its axis. She had known there was something dark behind Jack's wealth, but this was more than she had ever imagined. She was no longer just the innocent young waitress who had married a millionaire. She was entangled in a web of danger, betrayal, and secrets that could destroy her life. The truth was more terrifying than she had ever expected. Sophie now faced a choice: live with the man she thought she loved and risk everything, or escape before it was too late. But could she really walk away from Jack? Or was it too late to turn back? Sophie's mind was racing as Jack's words echoed in her ears. She could feel the weight of his confession pressing down on her, suffocating her in a way she had never felt before. The man she had trusted, the man she had married, was a pawn in a dangerous game, and she was now part of it, whether she liked it or not. "Who are these people, Jack?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What have you gotten yourself into?" Jack looked away, his gaze dark and troubled. "I can't tell you everything. It's too dangerous. You wouldn't understand, and I don't want you to get hurt." Sophie felt a surge of anger. She wasn't some helpless woman who needed protecting. She had survived on her own for years. "You're telling me I'm in danger, but you're not willing to let me in on the full truth? This doesn't make any sense. I deserve to know what I'm dealing with." Jack ran a hand through his hair, clearly torn. "I never wanted this life for you, Sophie, but there are forces at play here that you can't even imagine. I've been trying to keep you out of it, but I see now that I failed." Sophie was done with excuses. She was done with being kept in the dark. "So, what now? You just expect me to keep living this lie with you? What about our future, Jack? What about me? I deserve more than this." Jack's eyes softened for a moment, and Sophie saw a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with. But the moment passed quickly. He stepped back, shaking his head. "You don't understand. If you stay, you'll be pulled deeper into it. There's no escaping it. They'll come for you, Sophie. They'll come for both of us." The fear in his voice was real, and for the first time, Sophie wondered if she had made a terrible mistake by marrying him. But at the same time, there was a part of her that didn't want to give up on him. She had always believed in love, in fighting for what mattered. Could she really turn her back on Jack now, after everything they had been through? "Then help me understand," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "Help me understand how we get out of this. How do we fix this?" Jack looked at her, his expression torn between guilt and desperation. "There's no easy fix, Sophie, but I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. I just need you to trust me." Sophie didn't know what to say. She felt trapped between her love for Jack and the undeniable truth that his world was dangerous, unpredictable, and filled with lies. But one thing was certain: she could never go back to the life she had before. Everything had changed, and now she had to make a choice that would determine her future. As Sophie stood there, the weight of her decision pressing down on her, she realized that the path ahead was uncertain. But no matter what, she couldn't let Jack's secrets destroy her. She would fight, even if it meant facing the consequences of the dangerous world he had dragged her into. The stakes were higher than ever, and Sophie had no choice but to take control of her own fate. The question now was, would she survive the truth, or would it tear everything apart? The days that followed were a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and uncertainty. Sophie couldn't shake the image of Jack's face as he pleaded for her to trust him. But the more she thought about it, the more it seemed impossible. The man she had loved, the man she had married, was no longer the person she thought she knew. He was entangled in a world of secrets, lies, and danger, and Sophie was caught in the middle of it all. As the weeks went by, Sophie found herself becoming more and more isolated. Jack kept his distance, rarely speaking to her, and when he did, it was always about the danger surrounding them. He promised to keep her safe, but Sophie couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that he was hiding something even bigger than he had let on. She needed answers, answers that Jack wasn't willing to give her. One evening, after another tense silence between them, Sophie couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her coat and walked out of the house, determined to find the truth on her own. She needed to know what Jack was hiding, and she wasn't going to let him stop her. Sophie drove to the one place she thought might hold the key, the mansion where Jack's mysterious associates gathered. She had no idea what she was walking into, but desperation pushed her forward. As she approached the house, her heart pounded in her chest. The place was eerily quiet, but Sophie could feel the weight of danger in the air. She slipped past the gates, careful not to be seen, and made her way toward a side entrance. The doors were locked, but Sophie had come prepared. She had picked up a few tricks from her past, and now they were coming in handy. She managed to slip inside without anyone noticing. The house was like something out of a nightmare, dark, opulent, and cold. She moved through the halls, keeping to the shadows as she searched for answers. It didn't take long before she stumbled upon a room that seemed to be the center of it all. Inside, a group of men sat around a large table, their voices low and conspiratorial. Sophie could barely make out their words, but one name caught her attention. Jax. "They're getting too close," one of the men said, his voice laced with fear. "If we don't move quickly, the whole thing will fall apart. Jack won't be able to protect her much longer." Sophie's blood ran cold. Jack had been right all along. He couldn't protect her. She was nothing more than a pawn in a game that was way beyond her. Suddenly, a figure moved in the shadows, and Sophie froze. She couldn't afford to be seen. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to control her breathing. But the air in the room felt suffocating. She needed to leave before anyone noticed her, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. Before she could turn to run, a voice called out from the doorway, "I knew you'd come." Sophie spun around, her heart racing. There, standing in the doorway, was Jack. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that told her everything she needed to know. He had known she would come here. He had known she would uncover the truth. "I had to know," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "I had to know who you really are." Jack didn't say anything at first. He just stepped into the room, closing the distance between them. Sophie could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of the choices he had made. For a moment, it seemed like he might finally tell her everything. But then, he looked away, his jaw tight. "They won't stop, Sophie," Jack said quietly. "You're already in too deep. I can't protect you from them. You need to leave. Now." Sophie stood frozen, the truth crashing over her like a tidal wave. She realized in that moment that she had no choice. There was no going back. Her life would never be the same again. With a heavy heart, Sophie made her decision. She couldn't stay with Jack, not when his world was so dangerous. She didn't know if she would ever be able to trust him again, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let herself become a part of the world he had built. She turned and walked away, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. As she left the mansion, Sophie looked back one last time. Jack stood at the doorway, watching her leave, his expression unreadable. But Sophie didn't turn back. She had to move on. She had to rebuild her life, even if it meant leaving behind the man she once loved. And as Sophie disappeared into the night, she knew that no matter what happened next, she would never be the same again.